All right, welcome to another drive with me or drive-in talk or whatever the hell you want to call this. Me driving in my car while talking into its camera for YouTube episode. Welcome and hello again. If you've seen previous episodes, there's only really a handful, so there's not that many you could have seen, but nonetheless, I'm trying to make this a thing. So, while going about my day, figure this would be a way to kill multiple birds with one stone and drive where I need to go for the day, but also uh, get some thoughts out here. And so, what's kind of been on my mind lately has been the nature of power and corruption, how it works with humanity in general, but specifically also how it applies to the modern United States, right? And so, for years now, I felt kind of, I don't know, various degrees of down, depressed, admittedly, have not been happy about the Trump administration being in power, twice now, and really was disappointed with the Biden administration as well. Was even kind of getting disillusioned with Obama by the end. So honestly, this is more than a decade. This is close to 15 years now that I have felt like, well, politics is definitely not going to be the answer. We're sitting around waiting for an FDR kind of figure, or at least I have been, right? That kind of doesn't need to be democratic socialist. It doesn't need to be Bernie Sanders, but that's the type I was pulling for, and it didn't happen. It hasn't happened. And in fact, if anything, it's gone the opposite direction and in many respects has gotten worse. And things like AI have been concerning, but just not for the technology itself so much, more how people have responded to it. The way that the business community has tried to take AI and just lay off as many people as possible, right? Tried to do the thing that they've kept quiet and stated they wouldn't do and weren't trying to do. Like, oh no, we're here to make sure we protect people's jobs, and you give us tax benefits and tax returns, and you make sure that we have a soft touch governmental regime, and we'll make sure that everything trickles down, and we secure people's jobs, and we invest more in training and in equipment and so on. And they've leaned real heavily on the investing in equipment, but not the kind that saves jobs or even makes people more efficient by and large. This AI is really promising, or has been trying to promise, to just replace people in general, right? And it's this kind of multiple aspects of what I've been seeing, whether it's just the utter kind of pointlessness and mishandling of this whole situation with Iran that is still ongoing. And it's funny because I haven't really edited many of these drive with me videos, and I was starting to get worried, like, oh no, what happens if I was talking about Iran and then it turns out the war's done and a lot of what I'm saying is irrelevant, and then it's just kept going. It has not actually been irrelevant, and it seems like every time Trump says they're about to wrap it up and they're on the border line of a peace deal, they're just trying to get over that final hurdle, and then it doesn't happen. And it really, obviously, like what seems to be the case is he's BSing. He's just talking nonsense because that's what he does. And then he calls it the art of the deal, even though it really is just, he's not a particularly intelligent person as far as I can tell. I would love to be wrong. I'd love to find out he actually has been playing 4D chess and he's had America's best interest in mind this entire time, but that is not what I'm seeing. What I'm witnessing is someone who is very self-centered, who is using the presidency by and large to enrich himself, his family, and his allies and supporters, while punishing people he views as enemies, and really doesn't care much for the average person or middle class as a whole. And to be fair, he never has been middle class. He was born literally a multi-millionaire. I believe they said that by the time he was 2, and this was in previous years money, so I don't think it was inflation adjusted. It might have been, but anyway, I believe it was something to the effect of his dad was effectively gifting him. It was like the limit was like $2 million a year or something like that, and this was back in the 40s and 50s, when Donald was young. And so, I mean, this kid was, talk about it's not just a silver spoon. You then had the corporation, the Trump organization, handed to him at a fairly young age because his dad had legal troubles related to, surprise, surprise, kind of corrupt business practices and possibly defrauding the government. So he stepped down and made Donald, I don't know what, CEO or board or chairman of the board, whatever it was, whatever that position was that gave him that authority and power, to kind of avoid consequences. And how the heck that worked, I don't know. Like, it's kind of shady that that's how things roll in this country. You just replace people and suddenly it's somehow a completely new organization, even if it's the same family. I don't know. But anyway, that kind of goes to a larger point that regardless of side, it doesn't matter whether one tends to lean Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Independent, generally, you just hate politics, hate talking about politics. Either way, it's good to know the general structure of power. And it is easy to identify when corruption is in your face. It is easy to note it when it looks like a comic book villain, right? When it's in a Marvel film, it's kind of easy, generally speaking. Even if you can empathize with the villain, it's usually easy to identify them at least, right? And in real life, it often doesn't quite work that way. And I think a lot of us have realized this more and more over time, that often the most dangerous kinds of corruption is just apathy, just not doing your job, or somebody, whoever it is that is in a given position, just not doing their job correctly, allowing others to kind of unduly influence them because of money or because of privileges, or being sometimes as simple as a lobbyist taking somebody out to a nice dinner and convincing them that, oh no, when they say that their drinking water is bad, they're exaggerating, and this is blown up, this is going viral on social media, it's not a real thing. And this literally happens, right? Like, unfortunately, I'm not exaggerating when I say lobbyists will literally just say people are lying about things like their water quality, but this is what really happens. And if you're not from that district, as say a congressman or a senator, and you're not from that state or not from that area, it's pretty tempting to just kind of take their word for it, or at least go, well, I mean, if they're saying this, and it's not like we're having mass hospitalizations or whatever, it's not actually causing true problems as far as we can tell, do we really have to do anything about it? Is maybe these lobbyists are right, you know? And often they have a personal connections. They're like ex-congressmen. They're people that are known. They're people that are often fairly well off. They have connections in the community and in DC or in the state capitol or wherever it is that they're operating. And so it can be very easy just to do nothing, right? And that's where a lot of corruption happens, right? It's easier to do nothing, and it's easier to let business interests just kind of run the show. And when you have this mentality and this political structure that has emphasized it for about half a century now, notably since the late 1970s, this is the kind of result that you build upon over time. It's not immediate. It's not like flipping a light switch. The corruption and the hollowing out of the American middle class and of any kind of political legitimacy, as far as I'm concerned, and truly caring about the American people, has been slow. It is still not complete. I think there are still generally good politicians out there. I don't think a single politician has made every right decision. I don't think anybody can, right? Even the best politicians will have made mistakes, and often you only realize you make a mistake after you see how something plays out, right? So you often get kind of like, well, there's the tragedy that happened, so let's pass this kind of bill to, let's say, a tough on crime law. But then 30 years later, you realize that tough on crime law actually led to the imprisonment of a lot of people that shouldn't have, and it turns out it was unduly influenced by a private prison system. And so even though a lot of people with good intentions voted on these respective bills, they ended up contributing to greater corruption and inefficiency and just problems in our country that really should be fixed. And the same goes the other way. When, like, my original home state of California, right, where I was born and raised, passed a bunch of laws loosening up a number of like dropping various non-violent crimes from felonies down to misdemeanors, or raising the requirement of what it took to be considered a felony, and required, releases from jails, county jails and prisons and so on, for those that didn't meet new requirements and so on. Early release programs were mandated and so on. We didn't really put anything in place to help many of these folks actually become rehabilitated. We didn't turn around and put them into like low risk facilities. We gave them effectively a release, and that was it. There wasn't any kind of backup. There wasn't any kind of real secondary system to support many of these people. And so we have a criminal justice system that either ends up being typically heavy-handed without providing the proper rehabilitation and support system when people are out, and or they let people out, they ease up too much after having created that problem, and then also don't support them. We do the same thing with mental health, right? Where like back in the Reagan days in the 70s in California when he was governor, and then the 80s in the United States as a whole when he was president, a lot of cuts to mental health and behavioral health, community health in general, right? And then the general philosophy and thought process was, well, states will take care of it. And federal spending kept going up, but we didn't prioritize it for that sort of thing. States really generally have not done, not that the system was perfect beforehand, but they've done an even worse job and often provided less funding, if any, meaningful funding outside of some federal block grants. But it's funny how things that are really important to like people that are actually in need, we've over time spent less. It hasn't increased as much as inflation has hit. We have increasingly given that to the states, and the federal government really just spends more and more and more on the few things that it really intensely cares about, and primarily where a lot of money is, like defense spending is a great example. And then they've created over time a lot of public-private partnerships, which is a good way of saying that, like student loans are a great example, where the federal government hires a loan servicer, like, I don't know, Navient or Advantage or what have you. They often are shutting down, and I suspect that's kind of a roulette game on purpose to try to get out of legal issues, because they get into a lot of trouble because they don't do what they're supposed to do, and they don't tell people about their options because they make money based off of what they bring in, is my understanding, and they are motivated to not provide benefits, the benefits that are, say, required or encouraged or that they otherwise could do, because while they are often nonprofit companies, they still want to maximize what they're bringing in and limit what they're sending out. They're not an actual government service, they're still a company, right? And so what you've seen is decrease. You see this all over the place. Whenever you privatize things, by and large, you get lower wages for workers, you get fewer workers assigned to more things, and you get generally worse services, but more profits for those that are actually involved in whatever that industry is, right? You can get innovation, and that is a true element of the free market. When the customer is the government, like as is the case with student loan servicers, you don't really see that because there's not much of an imperative to change. That same problem can exist in government as a whole, but you have these non-governmental organizations that contract with them that are the worst of both worlds. They have the greed of private industry and the lack of innovation of a government agency. And so you see this, it's perpetuated and is infected a lot. And it really speaks to the nature of power structures and how tiered they are. So you have, I'm sure there are some, I mean, I haven't been privy to any of this stuff, but obviously, otherwise I probably wouldn't be making these videos, but I'd probably be doing something else or making a different kind of content. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if there are back rooms where there are deals being made that are almost like straight out of a comic book villain, scene, whether it be in an actual Marvel film or just, like a mustache twirling children's film, like villain from a children's film. Yet below the things that the public really doesn't see, is a whole lot of just rules and regulations. And you see this a lot with like HOAs. They do that, right? Where they wield the power of the pen and regulations and HOA ordinances and city ordinances and their rules and the requirement for them to approve things to get their way, and to at times punish people or heavily fine people for things that are really quite pedantic and so on, right? You see this kind of thing fairly often. Low-level, administrators and mid-level management and so on that are kind of the bread and butter of how the day-to-day nature of corruption and inefficiency really propagates itself. And a lot of this stuff is not an accident, right? Things working, like government working dysfunctionally, is not an accident. It's actually the design, right? The government and the United States kind of functioning as an unequal state, whether it be, having a tradition of being kind of, various degrees of racist to sexist or what have you. That's none of that has really been an accident. That's actually part of the design. So when many middle class white folks nowadays, including myself, have gone through a kind of a mourning and a grieving phase and had to realize this is this is the real America. The real America that we have is not white versus black or white versus brown or any other variation of that. And it sure as heck isn't male versus female or any other social distinction, LGBT versus hetero or anything else, right? None of those things really matter, though they do like to put that in the media, which a lot of these billionaires own, by the way, and put it forward and have pundits discuss how serious these issues are. In reality, what is going on is there's a tiered power structure that involves those with absolute power that we often don't see. I remember seeing an ad on YouTube talking about how if you know a family's name or their company, you know a person who's wealthy, or Elon Musk, Peter Thiel's, Zuckerberg's, Bill Gates, etc. They while they wield power, they're not the ones that are truly in power. And I suspect that's largely true. The ad then went into some supernatural stuff, and I skipped it after that. I don't know exactly where it was going. So I'm not interested in going down a rabbit hole that far, but I am willing to believe that many of the most powerful multi-generational families often kind of work in the shadows, and they operate through committees and think tanks and owning educational nonprofits and all these things that influence policy and work to convince people that bad ideas are actually good ideas through various arguments, whether it's school vouchers, whether it's really pushing for or against any kind of meaningful gun reform, etc. Like all of these things are examples of that kind of power in play. And then there's various tiers below that. There's your faces of the various movements, right? There's your Elon Musks and Trumps and Gates and all that. And they will power probably quite a bit of power, but I would say that's another tier down because they're not necessarily established. They're first generation multi-billionaires, a lot of them anyway, or their families are relatively recent up and comers. And while they're wielding power on a social level, they're not the established, quiet, behind the scenes. We have such a network that we are almost untouchable and don't even care to present ourselves. In fact, it would probably do more harm to our reputation or, more harm to our movement than good. So we're going to go ahead and sit back here. They're not quite there yet, right? And then there's your politicians, there's your CEOs, there's those that represent the billionaire and kind of established power class. And then there's, and obviously this is not like a real thorough breakdown of it, but there's just one tier after another that sits below them that serves to reinforce the power structure that existed, or that currently exists in this case, right? This is how it's historically worked. This is how many positive reforms or positive changes in the United States have been stopped. It's often killed quietly rather than overtly, attacked. And often all that political and economic and social elites need to do is convince us that something that the change that we're wanting is more scary than leaving it as it is, and convince enough people that that's the case. We're like, oh, even if this needs to change, like healthcare, right? You could even hear this on major news networks, like, oh, everybody agrees that healthcare needs to change. The question is how, and we don't think this is the right way to do it. And as long as they can convince enough people of that, almost nothing gets done. And then in the background, they're running interference plays and trying to water down bills that do exist, because you can tag on little amendments to existing bills. So you could have a budget bill or something to pass for, extra funding for veterans or whatever. And then they sneak in a little subsection of that bill that's like, well, we're going to defund this section of the Affordable Care Act, the ACA. And that kind of stuff has been happening. So overt overturning of things like the ACA is something that was tried multiple times because they wanted the publicity and the kind of the upfront kudos for it, I suppose, the notoriety, the infamy, the fame for it. And yet, um, it's kind of been declawed anyway, and it was largely a power handoff to insurance companies in the first place. So, like, the United States is kind of an example of almost anything good goes to die in Washington, D.C., in terms of good ideas, in terms of good policy. And I think there's a lot of good people there, especially if you look at like your interns and people that are young and like staffers for a lot of these politicians and so on. I think that's also why you see a pretty high turnover rate among them, because a lot of them get disillusioned pretty fast, pretty quickly. And what we tend to have is a system that is working poorly on purpose. And if you are, say, like African American, this may be no surprise to you. Maybe like, yeah, dude, like this is the version of America we've seen for generations. The kind of America and government that isn't for us, that is actively seems to be working for our disenfranchisement and for us to be doing worse and or staying in poverty. And now it's moved to the point that many white rich folks don't seem to care if they even hide the fact that they're doing this on purpose to everyone, regardless of race. They've used race, they've used ethnicity and culture, and they've used culture wars and right versus left and feminism and almost anything else you can imagine to justify the white working and middle classes staying on their side and identifying with the bylines and the positions of the wealthy, right? And they're increasingly seemingly willing to bet that that continues while also pushing us really hard. And they've been doing this in particular for the last 50 years or so, that they're squeezing us little bit by little bit through inflation, through greed, and through raising prices on things as they consolidate industries when they don't need to. So everything from electricity to food to your general goods as a whole, vehicles and computer products and clothing even, just has higher and higher profit margins while squeezing us more and more. The concept of the pricing what the market will bear is kind of filling in a lot of that excess spending that we used to be able to have, right? That discretionary spending just doesn't exist anymore. And this is the world we live in, and it's not an accident, but it's also a multi-layered complex system where there are a whole lot of people to blame and very few people to blame entirely. And that's exactly how they designed it. It is purposely obscured and opaque and multi-layered and spread out to the point where it's almost impossible to really identify, and even pulling the roots out is difficult. We need a cultural change, and change from the bottom that then reaches the top, right? And unfortunately, to do that, we may need to, like, if you imagine our society as a plant, you may need to cut that head, the flower off, the elites off of the plant, to then turn around and pull the roots up and like give them time to loosen up, if you will, so you can replant something better and grow it from the start. If that's kind of a mixed analogy there, but nonetheless, that's how I envision this. Like, we can keep the same concept, or almost like clip a runner off, right? Like a sucker off of like a tomato plant, and maybe keep that original foundation, but regrow it, because the current plant, the current system, the current nation is corrupt and rotting. So anyway, those are my thoughts for the day. I'm going to go ahead and get off of my soapbox. If you like what we're talking about here, feel free to stick around, because we'll definitely be discussing more of it. Take care.